They wrote that the western plains could swallow a man whole, not with violence, but with distance. Days stretched into weeks, weeks blurred into months, and still the horizon refused to come closer. In 1805, the Corps of Discovery pushed westward across lands few outsiders had ever seen. Dawn rose pale and thin over the Missouri River. The air smelled of frost and wet earth. Each morning, the men woke stiff from the cold, their breath drifting like smoke above their blankets. They were hungry long before they stood. Game was plentiful one day, scarce the next. A herd of elk might vanish into fog. A line of geese might lift just as rifles were raised. Some days they marched 15 miles with nothing but river water and hope. But on the hardest mornings, when traps were empty and the wind carried only silence, someone reached into a leather pouch. Inside lay small, dense pieces of dried meat and tallow, pemmican. Hard as wood, greasy to the touch. It carried almost no scent, yet it held the strength of 4 times its weight in ordinary meat. No comfort, no pleasure, just endurance pressed into food. The Métis and Cree had made it long before the expedition was imagined. They dried strips of buffalo in the sun, pounded them between stones, and mixed the shavings with melted fat. A single bison cow could give enough meat and suet to make a 90-pound bag, food that could outlast seasons. On the trail, the men did not speak while they ate it. They simply chewed, swallowed, and kept walking. For in that silent ration, dry, heavy, almost flavorless, lay the only guarantee the expedition could trust when everything else failed. Long before Lewis and Clark stepped into the northern plains, pemmican had already fed generations. Among the Cree, Ojibwe, and other nations of the region, it was more than travel food. It was winter insurance, a portable harvest stored in hide sacks, carried by hunters and families across vast distances. The word itself came from the Cree term for processed fat, an acknowledgement that survival in the north required more than meat, it required energy. The Métis, descendants of indigenous women and European fur traders, perfected the craft into an industry. Twice a year, entire communities formed hunting brigades. Men rode after the great herds of buffalo, women cut and dried the meat beneath the sun. A successful hunt might yield £1 million in a season, enough to feed traders, explorers, and entire settlements. For the young United States, pemmican was a foreign idea. Food on the frontier usually meant flour, salt pork, beans, or freshly hunted game, but such food spoiled quickly or required space the expedition did not have. Lewis and Clark learned this early. Their journals mention days when they ate through 4 deer and an elk just to keep moving, and days when they found nothing at all. Pemmican, then, became not only a provision, but a lesson in indigenous knowledge, a food designed for exactly the kind of land the expedition now struggled to cross, a land where distances were long, seasons unpredictable, and hunger always near. In 1805, as the Corps pushed deeper into what is now the Dakotas and Montana, they began to rely more heavily on what the buffalo had given, and on the method perfected by the Métis. It was plain, heavy, and often unappetizing, but the land respected endurance above comfort, and pemmican endured. The expedition kept careful notes, not only of geography, but of hunger. By early summer, game grew inconsistent. Buffalo herds moved unpredictably, following patterns the newcomers did not yet understand. Some days brought abundance, others brought only tracks. The men tightened their belts, not to hold up trousers, but to quiet the gnawing inside. Clark recorded stretches when the party marched all day without flesh to eat, carrying only hope of finding something before nightfall. Flour was rationed. Cornmeal was saved for the mountains ahead. Salt pork spoiled quickly, and fresh meat, even when found, lasted only hours in the heat. They needed a food that would not rot, mold, or vanish with the herd. Pemmican survived where they could not. It ignored weather, insects, and time. It weighed little for its power, and it fit easily into saddlebags and pockets. Lewis noted that one day's march could burn through the strength of several pounds of fresh meat, but a single pound of pemmican could replace them all. Still, no one pretended to like it. It was too dry, too greasy, too plain. But taste mattered little when the alternative was nothing. On the harshest days, when storms rose, when rifles misfired in the damp, when the river froze around their boats, the men reached again for the one ration they trusted. Pemmican did not ask to be enjoyed. It asked only to be used. And each time they reached that point, when comfort had failed, when hunting had failed, when their bodies had nearly failed, pemmican did what nothing else could. It kept them moving. Far to the north, pemmican was the heart of another story, one the expedition barely glimpsed, but one that shaped the world they walked through. In the early 1800s, two great companies battled for control of the northern fur trade, the Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company. Both depended on the Métis and on the buffalo herds for food to supply their posts in voyageurs. As settlers arrived and colonization expanded, food grew scarce. Territory disputes intensified. In 1814, a governor named Miles MacDonell issued the Pemmican Proclamation, restricting the export of pemmican from the Red River region. To traders and Métis communities, it felt like the shutting of a lifeline. Pemmican was essential not only for travel, but for trade, livelihood, and winter survival. The result was not negotiation, but conflict. Sporadic raids began. Storehouses were seized. Colonies were threatened. The struggle escalated into what history now calls the Pemmican War. Not a formal war with armies, but a chain of skirmishes, ambushes, and destruction that culminated in the Battle of Seven Oaks in 1816. It was, in its strange way, a war fought over calories, over the right to eat and endure in a harsh land. Lewis and Clark did not witness these events. They were years ahead of them, but they felt the ripples. Scarcity of buffalo in certain regions, tensions among traders, warnings from local guides. The pemmican they carried was not simply food. It was part of a larger economy of survival, a resource valuable enough to provoke conflict, and powerful enough to sustain empires of fur, trade, and exploration. For the core of discovery, pemmican meant miles gained. For others on the plains, it meant power. As the expedition pressed westward into the Rocky Mountains, pemmican shifted from a supplement to a necessity. Cold intensified. Snow clung to the peaks even in summer. Hunting grew uncertain. Animals thinned out in the higher elevations. Some nights the men boiled bones to scrape out the last traces of marrow. But pemmican, unyielding, patient, remained. Alexander Mackenzie, years before, had buried 90 pounds of it beneath a fire pit for his return journey. Others cooked it into rubaboo, a stew of flour, water, and wild onions. Still others fried it with potatoes or simply ate it raw. Lewis and Clark, too, learned its versatility. They boiled it with roots found along the riverbanks. They mixed it with parsnip tops. They softened it in hot water when their teeth grew tired of the dry lumps. It was never delicious, but it was steady, predictable, unchanging. A food that did not care whether a man enjoyed it, only whether he needed it. Over time, the great herds of buffalo declined. Settlements expanded, railroads cut across the plains. Métis hunting brigades dissolved. The Pemmican War faded into history. And pemmican itself, once a lifeline, became a memory, replaced by canned foods, farms, and modern transport. But on the long road west in 1805, it was pemmican that carried the expedition through the hardest stretches, not because it pleased the palate, but because it outlasted weather, distance, and doubt. A food made from the land, carried through the land, and eventually forgotten by the world that moved beyond it. But for those who once relied on it, pemmican was proof that survival did not always taste sweet. Sometimes it tasted like endurance. When the core of discovery finally reached the Pacific, they were thinner, weathered, and changed. Journals told of hunger, cold, and hardship, but also of what carried them through it. Among the maps and measurements, among the species catalogued and rivers charted, small notes appear, almost whispered, a little pemmican remaining. Our sustenance this day. We trusted to the dry ration. History often celebrates discoveries, routes, and achievements. But behind every mile walked was a simple truth. The men moved because they had the strength to move. And that strength often came from pemmican. A food older than nations, born from the knowledge of indigenous communities who understood the land better than any explorer, perfected by the Métis who turned necessity into craft, carried across prairies, mountains, and rivers into the journals of men who leaned on it without fully understanding its origins. Today, pemmican survives mostly as a footnote in history, a relic of a world where travel meant risk, and where survival depended on what could fit in a pouch. No sweetness, no comfort, only strength. And in the long memory of the frontier, that was enough.